Everyone is familiar with the interview question of what's your weakness, and a common way to answer this would be I'm a perfectionist. Similarly, in job interviews, being a perfectionist is dangerous business. Let's start with the first example here. Oftentimes, companies, especially during the final interview rounds, stack multiple interviews, even during one day. And what happens is the temptation for a candidate would be to deliver your best possible performance in each and every interview and at all times. And what happens is that it's rare for someone to be able to perform at maximum intensity throughout 6 interview rounds in one day. I'm making an exaggeration here, but to many candidates, it's actually quite impossible to be delivering at high performance, at maximum performance, even for 1 hour. So there's a tendency to deliver well within the first 15 to 20 minutes, and then your performance to be declining. So the fix here would be to invest, and to manage expectations, try to prioritize your performance to where it matters the most. And keep in mind, it's not about delivering perfectly at all times. The next very classic scenario in job interviews, and I've observed this over the years, it's not the candidates who impress or try to impress in job interviews that pass them. What do I mean by trying to impress? Well, it may well start with the little things. It may start with over-preparing your scene, such as preparing an HD webcam and a high-quality sound, looking, overly polished for the type of role you're applying for. And these sort of details, people who obsess over their appearance in a job interview are usually not the one with the highest probability to pass them. Furthermore, in my experience, for many roles, even for director level roles, staying scrappy is actually a highly efficient approach, and you should impress, but eventually with your subject matter expertise. Right? The next example is the illusion of a perfect delivery, and this oftentimes happens with candidates who cannot qualify what perfect delivery actually means. And this, to give an example, some candidates have a tendency to over-rehearse their interview answers. Some candidates even have a tendency to memorize interview answers. And what happens here is there's that law of diminishing returns. There's the initial great benefit you get from rehearsing your answers and from role play, especially if you lack interviewing skills. But with time, the more you'll rehearse them, the more likely you're going to become to suffer from a syndrome, what I call your answers becoming flat and boring and non-interesting, simply because you lose interest in delivering them with confidence during that job interview. So basically keep in mind that it's great advice to role play and to rehearse your answers, but to do it up until you feel like, hey, this feels right, I communicate the idea that I want to communicate clearly, and that's pretty much it. Except, of course, if you're applying for a role where communication, having exceptional communication skills would be key, but that's quite isolated, and these candidates know what they're doing, in my experience. The next thing, I like to present you with 2 examples of presenting the so-called perfect answers actually can backfire during these job interviews. There's a very common interview question: what are your hobbies, or what do you like doing outside work? And many candidates try to push the limits here with, mentioning some extreme stuff. I peaked all the major peaks, I climb all the major mountains, or I run a 10K every day, and these sort of things. And this might not come across as you think it would for many of these, the roles, even with the highest performing companies. Sometimes these interviewers are specifically looking for normality, for hobbies such as reading or walking. Might sound boring to many of you, but it's not always that. It's the candidates with extreme sports that are the best perceived interviewing with high-performing companies. Being a great software engineer doesn't require you to run a 10K every day, right? And maybe another example I'd like to share with you here, because this highlights something critically important that I observed over the years. Candidates, and especially people who are not skilled with behavioral interviews, tend to qualify interview answers a little bit differently. For example, if I ask you the interview question, how do you handle conflict inside your team? The absolute most impressive way to handle a conflict inside a cross-functional team would be by presenting an example of when you influenced an outcome, right? This would be most appropriate for a senior PM type of role, for example. Now, what happens is that if you present this type of example to a software engineer preparing for their job interview, I've seen cases, and it's quite probable that these software engineers will be tempted to answer this interview question, how do you handle conflict inside your team, with an extravagant answer of influencing, rather than matching the expectations of conflict resolution from a software engineer role. That is, you present a conflict with a colleague, a conflict with your manager, where the key was, when you use your subject matter expertise to prove your point with some data and this sort of stuff, and then to communicate that outcome reasonably well with the other party, right? This is when I compare the expectations from a senior PM or a director level roles where conflict boils down to influence most of the time. So notice here how perfectionism, can actually derail your chances to give appropriate answers in these job interviews. So in conclusion, try to build some critical thinking skills with these job interviews, because again, in my experience, it's not the candidates who try to impress, but are the candidates who try to stay scrappy in their appearance and maybe impress on their subject matter expertise and on their listening skills that tend to have the best outcomes. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.